Welcome. Thanks for watching Player Hearing Safety. In a few minutes, I'll tell you why I think it's a pretty close cousin to accessibility. But first, I want to introduce you to Patrick. Patrick is a former professional gamer. He played a 5-on-5 tactical shooter where hearing distant footsteps is critical. In order to hear those footsteps, he would play at a loud, though not necessarily extreme volume. That was fine for hearing the distant footsteps, but when gunfire or a flashbang went off right next to him, it was exceedingly loud. In this game, once he was killed, he also continued the game as a spectator. And even though he couldn't actively participate in the remaining battle, the game still gave him the full, quite loud audio experience. One day, Patrick noticed he had a constant ringing in his ears that just wouldn't go away. With some Googling, he discovered he had tinnitus at the ripe old age of 23. A permanent ringing in the ears caused by exposure to loud sounds for long periods of time. Patrick, it turns out, is also a programmer, and he wrote a program to modify the output volume during spectating. He would literally wrote some code that would detect that he was no longer actively playing, and then it would reach in to the Windows system volume and update that. Eventually, he expanded it to compensate for the volume of loud flashbangs and tinnitus simulation. He describes his program as a program that lowers volume when you are not alive and get flashed. It aims to lower the chance of hearing damage and fatigue by significantly reducing overall sound exposure. You can get that code on GitHub. On his GitHub page, he even says, "Even if you think your volume doesn't hurt you, trust me, it might over a long period of time. It took me 9 years of playing to develop tinnitus, and I was playing at a reasonable volume, judged by multiple non-gamers and me. I am no expert, but I suspect this is due to a buildup of small periods of very high volume, shooting, flashes, grenades, bomb dushes, and dinks, etc." And actually, he was correct. Players using this can set their volumes by editing a text config file. If you think about it, Patrick modified his gaming experience in order to not damage his hearing. And I would like to put a postulate out there that our players shouldn't have to go to GitHub to make their playing easier on their ears. So what does this have to do with accessibility? I mentioned the story about Patrick to Jenna Janissary of Descriptive Video Works. Jenna is an accessibility consultant, and she had a comment that really struck with me. She said, "The Venn diagram between audio accessibility and hearing safety is just about a circle." And if you think about it, accessibility helps compensate for player sensory damage or disability. Hearing safety helps us prevent that same damage. There's nothing inherently more dangerous about video games than movies or YouTube, except that we tend, or if we're successful, our players play our game for long periods of time. And especially with online gaming, they're more and more likely to be wearing headphones. Headphones are speakers either in our ears, near our ears, or covering our ears, with their transducers centimeters from our eardrums. And that's challenging. So, to talk about the challenge, let's compare sound to our other primary sense, vision. We evolved with the sun up in the sky. At any time, our ancestors could stare at the sun, totally destroy their vision, and theoretically not reproduce as well because of that. As a result, we evolved. We have eyelids. We can turn our heads. We can turn off our visual sensory input. Light in nature was dangerous to our eyes. The problem is, during our evolutionary period, sound in nature was not dangerous to our ears. We did not develop ear lids. Our ears are on 360 degrees all around us. So while it's painful to look at the sun because of eyelids, and we can turn our heads and so on, we can't do that with our ears. And in fact, it's even worse. There's a part of our ear system called the sacculus, part of the vestibular system, and that actually gets activated by loud sounds. And when that part gets activated, it makes us feel more excited. It triggers our hippocampus, which is associated with all sorts of hedonistic responses and large, exciting things. Evolutionary wise, we associate loud sounds with large, exciting, or group actions or big movements like banging on drums or large crowds. So for that reason, it's actually more enjoyable to listen loud. And that's a problem. So this is from a Seattle Seahawks game, an American football team. I was at this game. And being in a group of 70,000 people chanting at a loud volume really is an exciting thing to be. I could feel my sacculus and my vestibular system saying, yes, please give me more of this. When we are playing loud sounds, especially over headphones, it's kind of a cheat code for our brain because, again, in nature, we didn't have loud sounds to overcome, except in these rare circumstances. Again, so loud sound is kind of a trick, playing on our evolutionary development with modern tech. And it's a growing problem. This is from, just a short time ago in the New York Times that noise-induced hearing loss, especially in younger people, is a known problem. According to the CDC, hearing loss is the third most common chronic physical condition in the U.S., twice as prevalent as diabetes or cancer. And in fact, 1 in 5 persons aged 20 to 29 had audiometric notches, or sections of their hearing frequency range that were damaged or missing. So you've probably heard that we have little hairs cells in our ears, and that's how we detect sound. And that's true. And it turns out, though, there's actually 2 different sets of hairs. There's this single row on the top. Those are called the inner hair cells. And those are actually the only hair cells that actually can detect sound. There is a bottom group of hair cells there in that row of 3. And its job is to raise the volume of very, very, very soft sounds to the level where the inner hair cells can detect them. And that was really important. That helped us detect very soft footsteps in the grass far away so we could hear the tiger approaching and knew to run away. Of course, the problem is when these cells get damaged. Once they're damaged, they're gone forever. The different hair cells are sensitive at different frequency ranges. And again, those outer hair cells, which are more fragile than the inner hair cells, they're the ones that amplify the very soft sounds. So they're the first to go. This is, by the way, when people have a hearing loss, they sometimes get annoyed when you try and raise your voice to talk to them. They can actually hear loud sounds very fine, but it's the soft sounds that they have a problem with. And that's where you start to lose speech intelligibility. Being able to tell a f from a s, from a th, and a s. These different sounds become the same to somebody who has outer hair cell damage. I thought this would be solved by the time I got old, and turns out I was wrong. Once these cells are damaged, there is no way to fix them. Now, we kind of know this, but despite the fact that we know that we really should listen at a safe level, we just can't quite resist the desire to turn it up to 11 because it's more exciting, because physiologically it can be more exciting. So it's something we have to watch out for and be aware of. That picture's from an Apple Watch, and speaking of your Apple Watch, you may wonder where that came from. I'm sure many of you who have an Apple Watch or an iPhone have found their watch warning them that they're in a loud environment. Maybe you're in a bar that's playing too long with a loud band. That came from work done by the World Health Organization. Back in 2015, the World Health Organization recognized this as a problem. They believe it's a problem that will potentially affect 3 billion people. And in 2015, they started what's called the Make Listening Safe initiative at the World Health Organization. And their purpose was to develop some guidelines and a standard for devices and systems to make the active listening more safe, or at least educate people so that they knew about the systems. And in 2019, they published the WHO ITU H.870 specification guidelines for safe listening devices and systems. And they updated it in 2022. And this is why your iPhone or your Android device will warn you. Both companies have either adopted the standard directly or have features that are very heavily inspired by it. Now, the WHO deliberately left off gaming software and devices. They really just felt they didn't know that space well enough. So I mentioned Patrick earlier. I actually met Patrick out in Geneva at the WHO headquarters for a meeting on this very topic. They specifically wanted to pick up where the work they had left undone in their previous spec that was really designed towards things like iPhones and interactive watches. So over 3 years, they developed the follow-on to that standard called the H.H72 standard, published last May, Global Standard for Safe Listening Video Gameplay and Esports. And a question that came up during those 3 years of meetings were, are there things that game developers can do to try and mitigate this as well? And this standard is very much analogous to the previous one adopted by Apple, but for game devices and game software. And they're quite serious about trying to work with the games industry. I had Dr. Shelley Chatta, who heads this initiative up, out to Los Angeles, who spoke briefly at Game SoundCon to discuss the importance of hearing health and so on. So let's take a slight digression just for context here. When we say loud, how loud is loud? So here's some rules of thumb. 25 to 35 dB is a very quiet whisper. That's really being quite quiet. Normal conversation, about 60 to 70 decibels. 60 to 75, you're starting to raise your voice a little bit, speak a little louder. 75 to 85, you're speaking in a very loud voice. You notice it. 85 plus, you really can't have a conversation without really leaning in and almost shouting. And 100 decibels is a bar band. Another way to think of it is if you had headphones delivering sounds to your ears at 85 decibels, if you were wearing those on an airplane, you would think it was too soft and you'd want to turn it up more than that. And we'll talk about why 85 dB is important in a little bit. So the thing about sound exposure is the safety is really defined by how loud for how long a period of time. And we use a volume meter to measure how loud the sound is, usually in decibels. So in a sense, it's very analogous to radiation exposure, right? A Geiger counter measures how much radiation there is, and a person knows that they can be in that much radiation for a certain period of time before things are unsafe. And so the WHO and the ITU have gotten together to determine what are safe listening levels, which again are how loud for how long. And the standard they came up with was 80 decibels for 40 hours per week. So that's 8 hours for a 5-hour day. And so here's an example of that in table form. Now the challenging thing is that every 3 decibels increased halves the amount of time that is safe to listen. So while 80 decibels at 40 hours might be fine, if you bump it up to 89 decibels, that's down to 5 hours a week, or about 40 minutes a day. If you crank it up a little bit more to 95 decibels, that's about 10 minutes a day at 90 decibels is considered safe. So if our players are playing at 80, 85, 90, 95 decibels for more than just a few minutes a day, that technically is not a safe listening environment. Of course, you don't know who will get hearing damage and who won't from loud listening. Some people are fine, some are not. In that sense, it's a very much analogous to this habit, right? You don't know that whether smoking will give a particular person lung cancer. One cigarette probably won't. But some people who smoke are much more likely to get lung cancer. Apple certainly takes this very seriously. Apple knows that they're responsible for delivering sound to your hearing system using a product literally millimeters from your eardrum. They were very heavily involved in both the first spec and the current one about video games. Now, for game developers, this is kind of new for us, right? We never really thought about it too much before. But it actually is pretty close to some things that we've worked on. Loudness standards, listening environments, audio customizability, advanced audio settings, and accessibility. So, when Jenna mentioned this to me, I thought I would go do some looking into see what sorts of things do accessibility experts talk about when they talk about, delivering sound in a video game. And I came across Laura Kate Dale's, work, which was awesome. She's the editor-in-chief at Accessibility. And so I grabbed some examples from a video that she gave on accessibility. One example is to give some on-screen warnings prior to loud sounds, right? The following gameplay contains loud audio. This is from A Life is Strange. Another is to reduce the dynamic range of audio so that the loud sounds aren't as suddenly loud, like gunfires, explosions in Dragon Age the Veilguard. Chicory, A Colorful Tale has additional sound categories. Maybe you have misophonia and you just don't want to hear wet sounds. So that is starting to look a lot like the Venn diagram for some of the things that we do for hearing safety. Category volume controls, we'll talk about these in a minute. Dynamic range limiting, tinnitus sound effects, attenuation, dialogue captions, these sorts of things are very congruent both for accessibility and hearing safety. So let's take a look at what is in the WHO standard. The philosophy is let's inform the player, let's provide player control over the audio experience. This is not designed to be very forceful. It's a very light touch spec. So the WHO requires messaging. For example, at startup, convenient moments in the game, and that, of course, to be effective, notifications or messages should not compromise the gameplay experience. They're very cognizant of that. And include a description of the safe listening features. This is kind of analogous to sometimes, games that have epilepsy warnings and so on. The idea is to just inform the player. Let's have our player base become smarter about this topic. The WHO standard does require category sound volume controls. They declined to specify any details. They thought that would best be left for the game. This is something we're doing most of the time anyway. Those are really the two things that are required to meet the specification. There are some things they recommend as well, standard output levels for games so that different games are approximately the same overall volume level, a headphone safety mode so that if you plug a headphone in the middle of playing a game, you reduce the volume just to make sure you don't accidentally blast the ears out of the person putting the headphones on. And they also recommend that you simply look at your game and think of features that might make the most sense for your particular game. So what are some of those things that we can do? We're a unique art form, and that we can provide some control to our players over their sensory listening experience. It's just like Patrick did that, even though he kind of hacked the game to do it. Some of these features, frankly, belong to the audio team, but some of them belong to design, especially when it gets to user experience issues. So here's an example. Let's just put into play if this fits your game, let's implement into the game the kind of thing that Patrick did. Post-death spectating volume. Let the player control that. If they want to set that lower so that the game is softer while they're just spectating that, they can do that. Another example is to avoid the infinite attenuation curves. A lot of game engines use this asymptotic roll-off where the volume never quite gets to zero, and that unintentionally encourages loud headphone listening to boost those very, very soft but never quite zero sounds. This, by the way, is Unity's default volume curve. You can change that with a curve that gets softer as it gets farther away and then goes to zero. In fact, some games have already made this change to avoid that unrealistic, the sound never quite goes away issue, which does not encourage the player to turn up the game quite so much. An example might be adding impulsive sound volume control to specifically cover the level of weapons or explosions or gunshots. So let's give the player some control over that. And of course, some simple safe listening safety information. either as, for example, as part of the warning while they're playing, before they play the game. Or if you have a player health section of your website, add a hearing health section onto it. This is from Bungie's current website. They have a player health section of their website currently talking about photosensitivity and emotional mental health. No reason couldn't easily add information on hearing health there as well. So as far as the Venn diagram goes, I would agree with Jenna, right? Category volume controls, we already do that. Dynamic range limiting, make those loud sounds not so loud. Tinnitus sound effects attenuation. Captioning for dialogue, it makes it easier to understand the dialogue. And maybe for hearing safety, we add some granularity in that category volume control, add a little bit of messaging, and then again, think about what specific game-specific things that work for our game actually make sense. So wrapping it up, playing long and loud can be more fun and immersive, but it can be dangerous for our players. And as developers, we have an opportunity to let players mitigate that problem using features that are almost the same as what we were doing already for accessibility or other gameplay reasons, and by helping them become more informed players through some messaging. And probably minor tweaks to some things we're doing can actually make a difference. And again, we are in the best position to provide a safe and immersive experience. Our players should not have to create workarounds. So I've got a call to action. Consider adopting the WHO standard. And that really is because it's pretty light touch. It's mostly about messaging and information, appropriate volume sliders, and then look for areas of your specific game that would benefit from these safety features. And if you add an interesting hearing safety feature to your game, let us know, by all means. Another call to action is when you think about accessibility, let's start thinking about accessibility and player hearing safety, player sensory safety, kind of in the same breath, because I think they're very closely related topics, especially from how we present control over the sensory experience to our players. Another call to action, if you really want to go the extra mile, is gather some player listening telemetry data. What's the system volume setting? Are they on headphones or speakers? What are their audio preferences settings? How long have they been playing? Things like that. And share the data. Researchers have been looking at video games and hearing for a while, and they have to rely on surveys which are not the most reliable, or lab experiments which tend to have very small sample sizes. They would love some data from actual games, looking at the experiences of actual players. Oh, and by the way, your audio team will love this too. So thanks for watching. Here's some accessibility and player hearing safety resources. This is the website for the WHO Makes Listening Safe initiative. The actual H.872 specification for video games is listed there as well. And frankly, if you just Google Make Listening Safe WHO, you will get this as well. And please, you can reach out to me at hearing@gamesoundcon.com. So thanks very much, and I believe that leaves some time for a few questions.